Samantha had always known that she was different from the other girls in her town. While many of them were content with their quiet lives, bound by the rules of society and the expectations of their families, Samantha couldn't stand the idea of being tied down. From a young age, she had felt the pull of the wide open spaces, the mountains, the deserts, the endless sky. And she couldn't understand why anyone would choose to stay in a small town when the world was so vast and full of possibilities. Her father was a cattle rancher, a man who loved the land more than anything else. He had taught Samantha how to ride horses before she could even walk properly. She spent her childhood racing through the hills, feeling the wind in her hair and the freedom of the open range beneath her. There was nothing more exhilarating than the moment when she was on horseback, racing along the edge of the land, away from the rules, away from the expectations, away from everything. While other girls were inside learning how to cook, sew, and prepare for the role they were expected to play as wives, Samantha was out in the fields, helping her father with the cattle, riding, and exploring the wilds of the desert. Her mother often worried that Samantha was too wild, too free, and that one day she would become too difficult to control. But Samantha's spirit couldn't be tamed. She refused to follow the rules that everyone else seemed to follow without question. She wanted more. She wanted to experience life on her own terms, without anyone telling her what to do. Samantha's rebellious nature didn't go unnoticed in the town. There were plenty of men who had their eyes on her, drawn to her beauty and her wildness. But Samantha never paid them any attention. To her, they all seemed the same, polite, respectful, and boring. She didn't want a man who would sit by her side and tell her how to behave. She wanted someone who could understand her need for freedom, someone who wouldn't try to change her into something she wasn't. As she got older, the pressure from her family and the townspeople to settle down grew stronger. Her mother began making hints about marriage, and even some of the women in town would talk to her about the joys of starting a family. But Samantha wasn't interested. The idea of marriage felt like a trap to her, a cage she didn't want to enter. She had seen enough of the women around her, women who gave up their independence, their dreams, and their passions for the sake of their husbands and children. Samantha wasn't ready to give up her freedom for anyone, no matter how good-looking or charming they were. Every time a man approached her, asking for a date or offering his hand in marriage, she would smile politely, but inside she would laugh at the thought. She could never understand how they could be so content to live the life everyone else seemed to follow. There had to be more to life than just settling down, raising children, and following the same old routine. Samantha wanted adventure. She wanted excitement. She wanted to find out what was out there in the world, beyond the narrow streets of her town. But despite her resolve, there was always something gnawing at her. There were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when she felt a longing in her heart. She would see a couple walking through town, holding hands, or hear a mother talking lovingly about her children, and for just a moment, Samantha would wonder if she was missing out on something. But as quickly as the thought entered her mind, it would disappear. She couldn't let herself fall into the trap of a life she didn't want. The thought of being tamed by a man was enough to make her feel suffocated. Samantha's desire for freedom wasn't about rejecting love. It was about rejecting the idea of being controlled, of having her life decided for her by someone else. She wasn't afraid of love, but she was afraid of losing herself in it. The last thing she wanted was to wake up one day and realize that she had given up her dreams, her passions, and her independence for the sake of a man who didn't understand her need for space. Her closest friends often tried to talk to her about finding a good husband. They would tell her how important it was to settle down and start a family. But Samantha couldn't relate to their desire for the quiet life they seemed to crave. She would listen to them, but she couldn't help but feel that they were settling for something less. They were choosing the life that society told them they should want. But Samantha knew there was more out there for her. She just had to find it. It wasn't long before people started whispering behind her back. Some of the older women in the town began calling her unfeminine or too headstrong. They didn't understand why she didn't want to settle down and start a family like everyone else. They said she was too stubborn, too wild, and too independent for her own good. But Samantha didn't care what they said. She knew who she was, and she wasn't about to let anyone make her feel small for wanting more out of life. The more people criticized her, the more determined she became to prove them wrong. She wasn't going to be like the other women in the town who had given up their dreams for the sake of tradition. She wasn't going to let anyone tell her what she could or couldn't do. The world was too big, too beautiful, and too full of possibilities to stay locked in one place forever. It was during one of her rides through the desert, feeling the dust of the land rise around her, that she first saw him, the Apache Cowboy. At first, she didn't think much of it. He was just another man passing through, another cowboy with a quiet, serious air about him. But there was something about the way he carried himself that made her pause. Unlike the men she was used to seeing in town, this man seemed to be completely at ease with himself, completely sure of who he was. She watched him from a distance, intrigued by the way he moved with such confidence. There was no arrogance in him, no attempt to impress. He wasn't like the other men who tried to win her attention with words or grand gestures. Instead, he exuded a quiet strength that seemed to speak directly to her soul. His presence stirred something inside her, something she couldn't quite explain. For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of curiosity, maybe even interest. But Samantha was cautious. She didn't want to be swept up in something she didn't understand. She had been down that road before, and she wasn't about to let a man change her path. Still, there was something about this Apache cowboy that made her wonder. Who was he? What was his story? Little did she know, this was the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, freedom, and herself. And unknowingly, the man who stood before her would be the one to show her that sometimes it wasn't about being tamed. It was about finding someone who could accept the wildness within her and love her for it. Samantha had always considered herself someone who knew exactly what she wanted. She didn't want a husband or children. She didn't need the traditional life everyone else seemed to follow. Her world was filled with adventure, the open desert and the quiet beauty of the wild. She was used to being alone, doing things on her own terms. But when she saw him, this Apache cowboy, something shifted deep inside her. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was something different about him. At first, it wasn't his appearance that caught her attention. He wasn't the handsomest man she had ever seen, nor was he trying to show off in any way. He was tall and lean, dressed in weathered cowboy gear with a hat that shaded his face just enough to keep it mysterious. His movements were fluid, almost graceful, like a man who had spent his entire life with horses and the open land, moving with them rather than against them. What stood out to Samantha the most was his silence. He didn't speak much, yet everything about him seemed to speak volumes. There was no need for words. It was as though he was in tune with the earth beneath him, the wind around him, and the world itself. Samantha was used to men who tried too hard, who spoke in charming words and offered grand gestures. But this man, this Apache cowboy, was different. He didn't try to impress her with his looks or words. There was no effort to win her over, no hidden agendas. He simply existed, and that was something that intrigued her more than anything else. She would often see him in the small towns nearby, riding alone, his face calm and unreadable. He had an air of mystery about him, and Samantha, curious as ever, found herself drawn to him despite her initial resistance. There was something about the way he carried himself, as if he wasn't concerned with what anyone thought of him. Most men would have felt the need to speak up or make their presence known, but not him. He was quiet, confident, and completely at peace with himself. Samantha had always admired men who weren't afraid to be themselves, who didn't try to impress others with fake charm. She had seen so many men in town trying to win her favor with flattering words, hoping to charm her into submission. But Ramon, the Apache cowboy, wasn't like that. He didn't seem to care about anyone's opinion. There was something powerful in his silence. It wasn't arrogance or pride. It was just pure confidence in who he was. Over time, their paths started to cross more often. Samantha would be riding through the desert or visiting nearby towns when she would see him. Their eyes would meet for a moment, but neither of them spoke. It wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was just a quiet acknowledgement between two people who somehow understood each other. There was a connection between them, but it was unspoken. And for Samantha, it was both comforting and puzzling at the same time. One afternoon, while Samantha was out riding, she encountered him again. This time, she was more curious than usual. As she approached him, he looked up from his horse and they locked eyes. This time, there was no hesitation. She found herself asking almost impulsively, "Are you always this quiet?" His response was simple, but it hit her harder than she expected. "Not always," he said in a deep, steady voice that seemed to echo in her chest. Only when there's something worth saying. The words lingered in the air, and for the first time Samantha was struck by the depth in his voice. It wasn't just the words themselves. It was the way he said them. There was no hurry, no rush to fill the silence with unnecessary chatter. His words were like a quiet river, flowing with purpose and meaning. Samantha wasn't sure what to say next. She had been caught off guard, as she hadn't expected him to speak so openly. She had grown used to men trying to impress her with meaningless conversation, but Ramon's words weren't like that. They felt different. They felt real. He studied her for a moment before asking, "What's it like, living like you do?" Samantha was taken aback by the question. No one had ever asked her that before. They all just assumed they knew what her life was like, the free-spirited, independent woman who roamed the desert, doing whatever she pleased. But Ramon's question made her think. She had never really stopped to consider her life from someone else's perspective. It's what I want," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I don't want to live by anyone's rules. I want to experience life for myself, not the way everyone else says I should." Ramon nodded thoughtfully as if he understood. "Sounds like a lonely way to live," he said, his voice still calm but with a hint of curiosity. Samantha frowned, unsure if she agreed with him. "Maybe," she replied, "but it's the only way I know." Ramon didn't say anything else for a moment, as though contemplating her words. Then with a quiet smile he turned his horse to leave, but before riding off he said, "Maybe it's the only way you know right now, but life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it." Samantha watched him ride away, his figure disappearing into the distance. She felt an unexpected stir of emotions, something she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, she felt the pull of something deeper than just the thrill of adventure. There was something about Ramon, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, that made her question everything she thought she knew. As days passed, Samantha couldn't stop thinking about him. She realized that the more she thought about their brief conversation, the more she felt a sense of longing inside her. It wasn't the usual excitement she felt when something new came into her life. This was different. There was something about him that made her want to know more, to understand the quiet strength behind his silence. She had always thought of herself as someone who needed no one, but with Ramon she wasn't so sure anymore. Ramon continued to appear in her life, always at the most unexpected moments. Sometimes he would just pass by on horseback, his face unreadable but somehow familiar. Other times he would stop and speak, always with that same calm presence, as if the world could turn around him but never rattle him. Samantha, for the first time in her life, found herself drawn to someone not because they were trying to impress her, but because they had an aura of peace, strength, and quiet wisdom, and yet she couldn't bring herself to ask him more. She wasn't sure if she was ready to open her heart to someone else. She was still scared of the possibility of losing herself, of being swept up in something she couldn't control. But one thing was certain. The Apache Cowboy had stirred something inside her, something she had long buried under the weight of her independence, and though she didn't fully understand it yet, she knew that this was the beginning of something she couldn't walk away from. As time passed, Samantha couldn't deny the growing attraction she felt for Ramon. It wasn't just his quiet confidence or the way he seemed completely at ease with himself. It was something deeper. There was an undeniable connection between them, one that made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. For a woman who had spent most of her life rejecting the idea of being tamed, she found herself drawn to him in a way she didn't understand. But as much as she felt this pull, she was also filled with doubt. Samantha had lived her life on her own terms, fiercely independent and free from the constraints of a conventional relationship. She had always believed that love was something that could trap her, something that would force her to give up her freedom. She didn't want to risk losing herself in someone else. She had seen too many women, friends and acquaintances alike, who had surrendered their dreams and desires for the sake of a man. Samantha had promised herself she would never be like that. So despite the growing bond she felt with Ramon, she resisted. She made excuses, convincing herself that it was just a passing attraction, nothing more. She continued with her life, riding through the desert, visiting nearby towns, and keeping to herself. But every time she saw Ramon, something inside her stirred. His presence was a constant reminder that there was more to life than the independence she so fiercely clung to. One evening, as she rode along the familiar path that wound through the desert hills, She saw him again. This time, he was sitting by a small campfire, his back to her, the flames casting long shadows over his face. For a moment, she hesitated. She could turn around and continue on her way, avoiding him as she always did. But something told her that this time, it would be different. With a deep breath, she urged her horse forward, the sound of hooves against the dry earth the only noise in the stillness of the desert night. As she approached, Ramon turned to look at her, his face softening into a quiet smile. It wasn't the smile of a man trying to impress. It was the kind of smile that acknowledged something deeper, something that went beyond words. "Evening," he said simply, his voice as steady and calm as always. Samantha nodded, trying to keep her composure. "Evening," she replied, her voice betraying a hint of uncertainty she hadn't expected. There was a brief silence before Ramon spoke again. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but you're welcome to stay." The invitation was simple, but it felt heavy with meaning. Samantha wasn't used to being invited into someone else's space, especially not by a man. She wasn't used to being part of something, but something in Ramon's offer, the way he gave her the freedom to choose without pressure, made her pause. "I don't usually stop," she said, half joking, half serious. "I like to keep moving." Ramon smiled again, but this time there was a hint of understanding in his eyes. "I know," he said, his tone gentle. "But sometimes it's good to rest, to stop for a moment and just, hey." There was something in his words that struck a chord in Samantha. She didn't stop for anything, especially not for anyone. But here he was, this man who didn't try to change her, who didn't want to force anything upon her, and yet he made her question her need for constant motion. Why couldn't she just stay for a while? Why couldn't she just be present? Without fully realizing it, she dismounted from her horse and sat down by the fire. She could feel the heat of the flames on her skin, the warmth of the night air around her. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about what came next or how she would escape. She was just there in the moment with him. It felt strange but not unpleasant. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. After a while, Ramon spoke again, his voice low and thoughtful. "You know," he began, "when I first met you, I thought you were like the wind. Always moving, always free, never staying in one place for too long." Samantha looked up, surprised by the accuracy of his observation. "I am," she said, unsure of how to respond. "I don't like to be tied down. I can't be." Ramon didn't argue with her. Instead, he simply nodded as if he understood more than she expected. "I don't think love is about being tied down," he said quietly. "Love isn't about changing someone or making them stay. It's about finding someone who accepts you exactly as you are, someone who sees you, really sees you, and lets you be yourself." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. His words struck her deeply. They weren't what she had expected. They weren't the words of a man trying to win her over, trying to convince her to change. They were the words of someone who understood that love wasn't about control. It was about understanding and acceptance. For the first time, Samantha began to question her own beliefs about love. Could it really be like that? Could love be something that didn't take away her independence, that didn't force her to give up who she was? It was a difficult idea to accept, and it made her feel vulnerable in a way she wasn't used to. The night grew deeper, and the fire crackled between them, but the quiet conversation had stirred something inside Samantha. She realized that she had been so focused on protecting herself from being tamed that she had never allowed herself to truly experience the kind of love Ramon spoke of, the kind that gave space and freedom, not the kind that demanded conformity. But as much as she wanted to believe his words, she was still hesitant. Could she really let go of her fears? Could she let someone into her heart without losing herself? She wasn't sure. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, that it was hard to even imagine what it would be like to trust someone enough to let them in. Ramon seemed to sense her inner struggle. He didn't push her to say anything or to feel something she wasn't ready for. Instead, he simply sat with her, offering her the space she needed. It was a different kind of challenge than the one she was used to. It wasn't about fighting or running away. It was about facing her fears and being open to something new. "Don't rush it," Ramon said quietly, breaking the silence. "You don't have to have all the answers now. Love isn't a race." Samantha smiled slightly, grateful for his patience. He wasn't pressuring her to decide anything, and that made all the difference. She realized then that love didn't have to be the thing that chained her down. It could be the thing that set her free, if she allowed it. As the night wore on and the fire flickered low, Samantha felt something change within her. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but she knew one thing for sure. This was the beginning of something new, something she had never imagined. The days that followed the night by the fire felt different to Samantha. It wasn't just the physical distance she traveled or the miles of desert stretching before her. Something inside her had shifted. It was subtle at first, a small crack in the armor she had so carefully built around herself. But each day that crack widened just a little bit more, and with it came a strange sense of peace, a feeling she had never really allowed herself to experience before. For the first time, Samantha wasn't so focused on running away or keeping her distance from the world. She wasn't looking for the next adventure or the next moment of excitement. Instead, she found herself thinking about Ramon, about their quiet conversations, about the way he had looked at her, not with judgment or expectation, but with quiet understanding. He had never tried to change her, never tried to make her into someone she wasn't. He had simply let her be. That was the key, Samantha realized. It wasn't about being tamed or controlled. It was about finding someone who could accept her wildness, her independence, her need to be free. And in a way, Ramon had shown her that love didn't have to be a chain that held her down. It could be the thing that allowed her to soar higher, to be more of herself than she had ever been before. But even as she began to understand this, doubts still crept into her mind. Was she ready to let someone into her heart? Could she truly share herself with another person, even one as understanding as Ramon? She had spent so many years guarding her emotions, keeping people at arm's length, afraid that if she let someone in, she would lose herself in the process. It was a thought she couldn't shake, but as time passed, it became easier to push the doubt aside. When she was with Ramon, everything felt different. It felt like the walls she had built around her heart were slowly crumbling, piece by piece. She didn't have to be afraid anymore. She didn't have to keep fighting against her own emotions. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange, Samantha found herself riding alongside Ramon once more. They were traveling through familiar terrain, the wind picking up dust around them, but for once the world felt still. There was a quietness between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only comes when two people are in sync with one another, when words are no longer necessary. After a long while, Ramon spoke. His voice as steady and calm as ever. "You're thinking about something," he said. Glancing over at her, Samantha looked at him, surprised by how easily he could read her. She didn't even have to say anything, and yet he could tell what was going on inside her. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice quieter than usual. "I guess I'm just not used to feeling like this. I've always kept my heart closed off, afraid that if I let anyone in, I'd lose myself." Ramon didn't reply immediately. Instead, he gave her the time she needed to gather her thoughts. Then, in his usual gentle way, he said, "Sometimes letting someone in doesn't mean losing yourself. It means finding parts of yourself you never knew existed." His words hung in the air, and Samantha felt a weight lift off her chest. She had always thought of love as something that would force her to give up pieces of who she was. But now, for the first time, she was starting to see that love, real love, wasn't about losing yourself at all. It was about discovering new parts of yourself, parts that had been buried under years of fear and resistance. They continued to ride in silence, the soft sound of their horses' hooves in the sand the only noise. But Samantha felt a change within her, a shift that was hard to describe. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what was to come. She didn't need to have everything figured out. She didn't need to rush. She could just be here, in this moment with Ramon, and that was enough. Later that evening, after they had made camp, they sat together by the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the ground. The stars above them were clear and bright, and for a while neither of them spoke. It was a peaceful kind of silence, the kind that only comes when two people have shared something deeper than words. Samantha felt the warmth of the fire on her face, and with it, a warmth in her chest. It was as though the pieces of her heart, the ones that had been guarded and locked away for so long, were finally beginning to open up. She realized then that she was no longer afraid of losing herself. She wasn't afraid of being vulnerable with Ramon. After a long while she spoke, her voice softer than before. You were right, she said quietly. I've been afraid of losing myself in love. But now, I think I understand. Maybe love isn't about losing yourself at all. Maybe it's about finding someone who can see you, really see you, and still love you for everything you are. Ramon looked at her, his dark eyes steady and understanding. That's exactly it, he said, his voice low but certain. Love isn't about changing you. It's about accepting who you are. Even when you're not perfect, even when you're still figuring it out, it's about being there for each other, no matter what. For the first time in a long while, Samantha felt a deep sense of peace settle in her heart. She had always been so determined to remain free, so determined not to let anyone in, that she had never stopped to think about what true love could be. But now she understood. True love wasn't a cage. It was a partnership, a connection that allowed two people to grow and be their truest selves. As the fire crackled and the stars continued to shine above them, Samantha leaned back, letting the quiet of the desert wash over her. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had found something she never thought possible. A love that didn't demand she change. A love that accepted her for who she was. Exactly as she was. And in return, she could offer him the same. It was a realization that felt freeing, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She wasn't giving up her independence or her freedom. She wasn't losing herself. Instead, she was allowing herself to love in a way that felt real, in a way that didn't require sacrifice, but rather understanding and trust. As the night wore on, the conversation between them grew quieter, but the bond between them grew stronger. For the first time in her life, Samantha felt as though she had found something worth holding on to. A love that would allow her to be free and fully herself, all at once. As the days passed, Samantha and Ramon's bond grew stronger. It was clear to both of them that something special was blossoming between them, something neither had expected or planned for. The connection they shared was different from anything Samantha had ever known. It wasn't about grand gestures or fiery declarations. It was quiet, steady, and most importantly, it felt real. It was the kind of love that didn't ask for anything in return. It just was, and for the first time, Samantha wasn't afraid of it. She had spent so many years guarding her heart, building walls around herself because she thought that love would only take away her freedom. But now she realized that love could coexist with her independence. Ramon had never tried to change her or control her.
He had shown her that love wasn't about losing yourself. It was about growing together, supporting each other, and accepting one another fully.
And that was something Samantha had never known was possible. She had always believed that love was a burden, a trap that would take away her sense of self. But with Ramon, it felt like a gift, a freedom she hadn't expected. When she was with him, she felt stronger, more herself than ever before. There was no need to hide, no need to pretend. She didn't have to be anyone other than who she was. It wasn't just the big moments that made her heart feel full. It was the quiet times, the moments of shared silence, the way Ramon looked at her with those steady, understanding eyes, the way he would listen to her, not just with his ears but with his heart. She had never had that before, someone who truly understood her, who didn't try to fix her but simply accepted her. One evening, as the sun began to set over the desert, casting long shadows across the land, Samantha sat beside Ramon on a rock, watching the colors of the sky change. The air was cool and the desert seemed to breathe with them. There was a peaceful stillness in the air, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Samantha had always been someone who lived in the moment, constantly moving, constantly searching for the next adventure. But now, with Ramon beside her, she found herself content with just being. She wasn't thinking about the future or worrying about what might come next. She was simply here with him in this moment. "I never thought I could feel this way," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I never thought love could feel like this. I always thought it would change me, force me to become something I'm not, but with you, I feel like I'm more of myself than I've ever been." Ramon didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out and took her hand in his touch warm and steady. There was no need for words. In that simple gesture, Samantha felt a deep sense of peace. She had spent so long running, so long keeping people at a distance, afraid of losing herself. But with Ramon, she didn't feel like she was losing anything. She felt like she was gaining something she hadn't even known she needed until now. "You don't have to change, Samantha," Ramon said after a long pause, his voice calm and sure. "You are exactly who you are supposed to be. And I love you just the way you are. Love doesn't ask us to change. It just asks us to be open, to let it in, to accept it for what it is." His words washed over her like a gentle breeze, and for the first time, she truly understood. Love wasn't about expectations or demands. It wasn't about fitting into someone else's idea of who you should be. It was about being true to yourself and finding someone who could accept that truth. And that was what she had found in Ramon. For the first time, Samantha allowed herself to believe that love could be a partnership, not a surrender. It wasn't about giving up her wildness or her independence. It was about sharing those things with someone who respected them, someone who could stand beside her. Not in front of her or behind her, but beside her. Ramon didn't want to control her. He wanted to walk alongside her, to share the journey of life with her wherever it might lead. In the quiet moments they shared, Samantha realized that she was no longer afraid. She no longer feared losing herself in someone else's arms. She had found someone who could accept her wild spirit, her need for freedom, and still love her fully. That was a gift she had never expected to find. Days turned into weeks, and their love continued to grow. They shared laughter. They shared silence. They shared dreams and fears. Samantha had never thought she would find someone who could match her in spirit, someone who could understand the depths of her heart. But with Ramon, she found that and so much more. As the days passed, they began to talk about the future. For the first time, Samantha wasn't afraid to dream. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she knew that as long as they were together, she could face whatever came. She had always been someone who thrived on freedom, on adventure. But now she saw that true freedom wasn't about being alone. It was about choosing to share your life with someone who supported you, someone who didn't try to change you but encouraged you to grow. One evening, after a long day of riding and exploring the desert, Ramon and Samantha sat together once more. The sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of pink, purple, and gold. They were both quiet for a moment, watching the day slip away. Then Ramon turned to her, his eyes warm with something deeper than just affection. "I don't need to change you, Samantha," he said softly, "but I do need you. I need you by my side. We don't have to be the same, but together we're stronger." Samantha felt her heart swell in her chest. She had spent so long fighting against the idea of love, believing it would be a burden, a cage that would steal her freedom. But now with Ramon, she saw that love could be something beautiful, something that enhanced everything she was, not something that took away her spirit. "I need you too," she whispered, her voice filled with the truth she had finally allowed herself to admit. "I need you more than I ever thought I would." In that moment, something shifted. The walls that had once held her heart captive crumbled completely. She wasn't afraid anymore. She didn't need to hide from love. She could embrace it fully, knowing that it didn't mean losing herself. It meant finding a deeper part of herself, a part that had been waiting to be set free. As they sat there watching the sunset together, they both knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Love, for the first time, felt like a bond, not a chain. It wasn't about losing themselves in each other. It was about finding a new way to be free, together, and that was all they needed.